Okay. Got it. We are being live streamed.
Okay. I'm this up a little bit so I can't. All right. I guess that's going to work. I guess that's the way it's going to go. All right.
All right. There we are.
Now, okay. Now it's going to find ourselves on here and I will get there. I promise I will. If you just stop nagging.
Not nagging.
Stop yelling at me. It'd be helpful. All right. Here we go. Okay. I'm good. I'm here. I am here. Anyway, there's something wrong with my headset, though. I'm doing a lot of bitching today.
Yeah, you are more than usual.
A lot of complaint, a lot of anger, a lot of anger therapy today.
More than usual.
Anyway, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, all right. Let me know when you're ready.
All right. No, I am. We're already live.
Oh,
There's
okay.
apparently one person in here.
Oh, that's probably just me.
I know
Anyway.
it's Travis.
Oh, hey guys. Hey.
Hey, Travis.
Oh, God.
Hi, Travis. Hi, Miranda.
Hey, what a nice morning this is today. It's like 60 degrees and it's beautiful today. After we had those Armageddon storms roll through here last night.
Yeah,
was
that
pretty
tornado
exciting.
warning was something else. I'm glad we saw Oppenheimer when we did, because I don't think we would have been seeing it.
We saw the movie. We didn't actually see him.
Well, no. But yeah, the movie's really good, by the way. I mean, non-Civil War talk with Oppenheimer is amazing.
Nope, that was a good movie. It definitely was. It was definitely worth going to see. So it's a stupid
very good
thing here. Anyway, so what's going on? How are you? What's new?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm fine. It's Sunday, which kind of sucks because tomorrow's back to Monday again, but we're doing good. So yeah, so it's been a good day. So hopefully people are enjoying themselves as well.
We've got a lot of people on here. Good morning, Scott, Paul, Miranda, Barbara, E, Travis.
Yeah. Oh, good morning, everybody.
Miranda.
Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty good stuff. So yeah, so we did our episode, I guess.
On the draft
riots, and that's a fascinating story, and it's so funny because we said this in the episode thing, but when you really study that and you really get into it, it reads like a novel, like it's a fictional story.
It's very violent, and it's not something that we said this in the episode. It's not something that gets talked about a lot, because it is such a dark period in the North. And we watched Gangs of New York last night. It's one of my favorite movies. I've seen it a billion times, but every time I watch it, I'm reminded of how good it was. But watching it after we did the episode I noticed so much more. Like you pointed out, the fact the black joke is in there. Yeah. I didn't realize that Horace Greeley is a character, very minor character, but you pick up on these little things that, unless before we did the episode, I didn't see them in the movie. And then all of a sudden, they're there, and I enjoyed the movie that much more. Now, it's not 100% historically accurate. As we discovered, Bill the Butcher was actually killed, I think, in 1855.
Right.
So I need to look this up, but I think he's a melding of a few different characters that would have been in the 5 points at the time.
Well, for people who, the movie's pretty accurate in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, like they have the black. If you're a Civil War nerd and would say listen to our episode and then watch the movie, and you'll notice little things, like you'll see the black joke at the fire, right? Like Tammany comes with them, right? And then someone's like, "It's the black joke." Get them.
Well, that's the thing is, you think about it, was the fire departments in New York, and everybody thinks of the New York Fire Department, how they think of it now. They were a volunteer fire department. Like we have friends in Pennsylvania who are volunteer firemen. That's how New York City was, right? But the problem was they were rivals. And so a lot of these, like the black joke was a name of of a bunch of gang members within a fire department. They would come to put a fire out and then loot the house while they were there.
Yeah. And
then if the other firemen came to put it out, they'd beat the hell out of them. This is it's a different thing. And if you've seen the movie The Warriors, it was a movie that came out in the 70s. It was a gang movie. It was kind of like it wasn't like it, but it was similar to how you had different gangs in the city of New York that were different immigrant groups.
Yeah.
It was mostly Irish, but you had the Dead Rabbits, you had the Plug Uglies, you had the Bowery Boys, you had all the black, right? Yeah. And so you had these competing in the 5 Points area of New York, which is still there, where they were just ganglands, and then it was this festering hatred amongst them, the native people from New York, which I don't blame them because I don't like New York either, but it's okay. but also you have you had the black population, which we showed went from 1930 to 1960, jumped tremendously. And you had this bubbling hatred in the city.
1830 to 1860?
1830, yeah. 18. This bubbling hatred in the city. and all these tensions and this anger and this over economics. And then you have the Tammany Hall. You've got Boss Tweed and these guys like Fernando Wood, the mayor at the time of New York City.
I don't know if he was a character. I saw a guy.
No,
I saw a guy that was in it that I'm like, I wonder if that's Fernando Wood. You know, the other guy that wasn't in it that we talked about a lot in the episode was General Wool, who becomes the scapegoat at the end of this all. But one of the most telling lines, and I had never heard, like, you know, I'd heard it before, but it really hit me last night when Leonardo DiCaprio, when his character, he's Priest Fallon's kid, says, you wouldn't know there was a war going on in New York City.
Yeah.
Because they were that much further away from it. And that even though like they show at the docks, like all these coffins being unloaded and, you know, men being recruited as they got off the boats. Now, whether or not, like, I don't know if that's 100% true or not, but the thing is like the war is going on, but it's like the people of New York are kind of in denial about it. But that really speaks to how things are at the home front in a state like New York. And it goes back to the politics. It goes back to the Copperhead movement. You understand why it was such a thing. It's like, why would, you know, in the movie Copperhead, which is an excellent movie, you know, the main character in it says, why would I care about what's going on in Virginia? Why should I send my son to fight? I live here in New York State and I'm a farmer. Like, why would I do that? You know, and it goes back to the politics of the time. Miranda says, I've read about the draft riots a ton just in context of overall anti-Irish discrimination. It is just such a fascinating time in New York. It's fascinating, but it's brutal. And then, you know, you have the Irish, these immigrants, they go after the African Americans. Like it's very much becomes like what we would term today a race riot.
No, it was, but the Irish also fought the Irish, and that was thing. Was you had and you see a lot of that, and you saw a lot here in Boston too, as a matter of fact. But you know, in that whole context, you had these people put in these ghetto type dock towns. And the 5 Points is where it primarily was, and they would fight amongst themselves. It was kind of like the survival of the fittest, and then you had the locals, but then it was when that black thing really got put into it. And obviously the flashpoint was the Enrollment Act. And that was the big thing, because, and it's just a fascinating part of it, because you had the situation where by the time July of 1863 happened, certainly African-American people could volunteer. We had the, first Kansas, the 54th Mass, all that stuff. But, when you had that quota system set up and you didn't have the quota numbers, you went into the drafts, and it was literally like a draft. You put your name,
it was a lottery. Like you pulled your name out, and then if you had $300, you could put in a substitute. And that's the thing. Like there's one part when the riots start that you hear someone say, "There's a $300 man."
And that was a common thing. And so you had that, and so you had people who couldn't afford it. $300 was about $9,500 today, and it might as well have been $1 million because they couldn't afford it. And what got them pissed, went up their ass sideways, was they're fighting for emancipation at this point. They don't like them anyway, but now blacks can't be recruited into it. They can't be drafted because they're not citizens yet. So like, you want us to compete for these people for jobs, and then we're going to go fight for them, and then they can't go into it. So it was, and now that whole $300 thing was one of the more underrated Lincoln fuck ups.
Oh, it big time was.
And he did it to throw a sop at the rich merchants, saying it's a backdoor to get out of it. But when you look at some of the decisions he made throughout this war, I mean, I apologize to the Lincoln people, but I mean the fella did not walk on water. But defend him though, he is trying to make these decisions in real time. He's fighting against the Tammany Hall type Democrats. He's fighting against a lot of the people in the North, the Peace Democrats. So he's trying to fight a multi-front political war too. Oh, by the way, Halleck and Stanton are trying to screw him every chance they can.
Exactly.
So that he's not some bumbling fool here. But when you look in hindsight with that 2020, 160-year-old, telescope, you realize that, maybe that $300 thing was not a good idea, because, and like we said in the episode, the ironic thing about it was they stopped the draft anyway. It didn't really factor in because blacks did volunteer in large numbers, so they ultimately did take the place of the Irish anyway. And of course, he didn't know that at the time, but at the time, you've got a festering dumpster fire in New York City that's just waiting to burn, and he threw gas on the fire. It's a lot like the Pratt Street riots. It's a lot like that. It's a lot like him calling up the 75,000 troops in 1861. There are certain things he did that threw gas on the fire, but I mean, it's easy for me to sit here years later.
It's easy for us to say that, but I mean, he did do things that were not great. So David Maxwell is currently in middle of nowhere in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So he's in the UP right now. That is in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful area.
I don't know why the Upper Peninsula is in Michigan, by the way. It shouldn't be in Michigan. No.
There's some subreddit where it's like, where's the UP gone? And it's maps without the UP. It's really weird.
Yeah.
Barbara had a question. She said, were there draft riots in any other cities? I think there was one in Buffalo.
It wasn't a draft riot. It was a racial riot. It was more,
Buffalo.
It was in Buffalo. I think it was 1857, 55, right around there. So you had a bunch of dock workers who were working along the Erie Canal in Buffalo. And they were still pissed at all the Bills Super Bowl losses. So they were already mad. Okay. So what happened was when you had the blacks, similar situation, they ended up fighting. So I don't think it wasn't a draft riot, but it was a racial thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it did happen, but that was the big one. Because it was specific to the draft, because the draft didn't last that long.
No.
They finally pulled the plug on it because they didn't need the numbers anymore.
Yeah.
But the Buffalo one gets there's a lot of publicity. If you look up the Buffalo riots in you can read all about it. There's some it's just, people getting drowned, and it's a bad situation.
I mean, and New York is bad too when the riots happen. Like we told some stories, or you did on the episode, that are they're horrific, but they happened. Like it was bad, and it's shown to be really bad in the movie as well. Like they're showing, like they're hanging African Americans, they're going after the wealthy. It starts by someone just throwing a brick through the window, and then they just go. And then most of the casualties were when the Union Army, men from the Union Army, finally arrived, and they just shot into the crowd.
Well, that's the thing too, is when you think about the fact that you have, literally the movie The Purge is taking place in New York City in 1863 in July. They're hunting. We talked a lot of stories like, Abraham Franklin, right? That story.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them. And then you have the military coming to put it down. Most historians think there's about 120 casualties, which most people think is probably very, very low. But about 80 to 90% of that number was the rioters who were gunned down in the streets by rifle fire and canister fire.
Yeah.
A lot of it's right on Fifth Avenue in New York City, Gramercy Park, New York.
Yeah.
There were people sitting outside drinking their foo-foo, cocktails, Mary.
Not their Narragansett.
Right. Not Narragansett. But that's the site. That's the site where you had the U.S. military firing upon citizens. And the thing about it, you would think something like that would be like the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre, these big flashpoint events. Mm-hmm. Not only are they not taught in history, but there's barely a marker in the city of New York that explains it. And
I think it goes back to the narrative that it's like, it's a very dark part in American history, but part of the Civil War. It shows racism, prejudice against, not just Irish, but African Americans, especially. And it shows that, in the North, they were just as racist as in the South. And there is a narrative that has come out fairly recently that, it's kind of like, let's make the South look incredibly evil, but it's not talked about that the same stuff was happening in the North too. Like, this is like Bill the Butcher is, I don't like him as a person, but Daniel Day.
Well, but you understand that character as a character. He's like Jason Voorhees. He wasn't that bad in real life at all. They made him, I think, mix different people in together. He was basically just a gang leader, is what he was. But that's what he was. But again, when you look at all the things that went down with this, and once the riot gets going, you have politicians looking to maximize it. You have Horatio Seymour. He does his famous "My Friends" speech on July 14th, where he sits there and says, friends, then he's going to blame the Peace Democrats to get. So what he does, he goes down there to try to calm everything. But what he does knowingly is throw gas on the fire to get it more going, because they knew when this thing.
I mean, a lot of this has been incited by the media as well.
Because when this thing's over, Horatio Seymour, Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, all these people they know they're going to benefit from this, because they know they're going to protect the Irish, because they know they're basically buying their votes.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what do? They end up paying the $300 for people in New York City who got calls.
Yeah.
So that's
keep them there, to keep the votes there. Because remember, there's that scene at the end of the movie where Tammany, or I guess it's Boss Tweed, he's there and they're throwing, just in this mass grave, people that had been killed in the riots. And he said, we have to make sure we're going down to the docks tomorrow to give the Irish soup, to give soup to the Irish to get off the boats, because we have just lost a lot of votes. And it's it's like, holy shit, this is really about voting and politics. It's not about like
the whole draft riots. Unfortunately, was a political opportunity that was pushed. And that's really something, because, the morning of July 11th is the first day of the draft, and they're going to have this draft. And it's a Saturday, so nothing really happens, so they think everything's gonna be okay. George Opdyke, he's the mayor at the time. Fernando Wood's gone now, so Opdyke's the mayor. The next day is Sunday, so there's no draft. It's Sunday. So Monday they decide this is Monday, July 13th. They're gonna have a day of protest where all the factories are closed, the docks are closed. They're gonna come down. They're just gonna protest, and the draft gets started. And what happens is, a couple of the firemen, the volunteer firemen, they get their name called. And up to that point, if you were a fireman in New York City, a volunteer fireman, this is the Militia Act now, you were exempt, because the National Guard was away fighting. They were in Gettysburg, the New York National Guard. So you hear two of your guys, and these are gang guys. They get called and someone fires a shot. They burst through the building and ends up being right down there on 48th Street. They're going to burst in. They're going to burn the draft stuff. They're going to burn the buildings. The firemen come and they jump on the other side to join the riots. And then it spills. It just turns into this dumpster fire where there's rolling hell. And it can't be stopped, because there's only 1,400 policemen in the city, because everybody else is off fighting.
Yeah.
There was more damage done in New York City than any Confederate army did in Northern City.
Yeah, it was in the millions upon millions of dollars, like millions of dollars back then. But now it's like you put in today's dollars, it's insane. David said, "Love the Mr. Tammany effing Hall and gangs in New York," and he said that one line, "I'll festoon my bed chamber with your guts." Ryan's on here from England. He said, "Are you guys abusing peaceful, sober, hardworking Irishmen?"
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly.
And Frank says, "Good morning, happy Battle of the Crater 159th."
That is today's the
good morning,
159th. Hey, MJ, 159th of the Crater. So we're going to do that episode this week, right?
Yep, we are. Yes, we are. Our next episode is going to be the Crater.
Yeah,
we're very much looking forward to doing that.
So just to try to stay on topic here, I'll do my best, Mary.
Well, we don't have to. We go all over.
I'm just fascinated by these riots, though, because the fact that it happened here, and it's just not really. People know about the draft riots casually, the Civil War people. Some people know more than others.
Yeah.
But when you see how impactful this thing was, and there's that unfortunate story where they burned down the Black orphanage.
Yeah.
And one kid gets killed because he hides under the bed and he burns to death. And there's so many stories that go on with this. And, you mentioned before Horace Greeley, he's running the New York Tribune, which is a very pro-abolitionist Republican newspaper. So the Irish, they go to burn the building down. And for some reason, the employees have Gatling guns.
Yeah.
And they roll them up. The Boston Globe does not have Gatling guns, as far as I know. They rolled them up. They didn't use them, but they were like, nope.
I know the guys are like, nope. And I mean, Horace Greeley in the movie, he like escapes and he's like, oh my God, they're rioting.
But the thing about this too is we're not talking about, Conor McGregor here. We're talking about women rioting, children rioting. I mean, this was, like we said before, only Brian Cashman pisses off New Yorkers more than these guys did. Right. And that's the Lord's honest truth. but that's how bad this thing was. It just blows my mind that I didn't learn about this till I was probably out of college, and I studied history forever. I'm like, I knew this thing existed, but I thought it was just people just protesting. I don't want to do it. Screw you. And then when you get into it and you go, holy shit, how is this not a bigger deal?
Yeah. Well, I learned about it through the movie Gangs of New York when it came out in 2002. That was, and I was like, I had no idea this had happened. But, you know, like we were saying, the thing is it shows this brutal dark side in the North that often doesn't get talked about. And it's another side to the city, to the Civil War, that, you know, there are people that, you know, like they don't like the idea of emancipation and they live in the North. You know, that's a reality of the Civil War.
Well, we talked a lot about that because the economic factor. New York City was a very, I don't want to say pro-Southern city, but economically was extremely tied to the South.
Yeah.
They received, I think it was 50% of their exports out of New York City were based in Southern cotton. So when you have the embargo and you can't take that cotton anymore, that cuts a lot of the income down, which means less jobs. And if you're, and you could see why people like Fernando Wood and the Copperheads decided to try to secede from the Union, be a free city, because that was taking away their lifeblood. That was putting their foot on the throats of the New York City's economy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right? And it's being cut off. And I mean, Fernando Wood he's a fucking bastard. Like he goes like, I don't know if he's got any like a good side to him. He's just so crooked and twisted, like especially with what like we talked in our episode about Oliver Otis Howard. The reason Howard with the Freedmen's Bureau has such a bad reputation is because of Fernando Wood. And just
somebody like Fernando Wood. He had 16 children, so somebody liked him.
Oh God. Jeez.
Like 16 children.
Oh, Thomas Brown's here. He said Thomas is here, Yankee baseball.
Oh yeah, if you look at the standings upside down, they're doing pretty good, Thomas. So good luck. Hope you're enjoying your summer. You know.
But MJ, my God, the North has a dark side in the Civil War. Well, the race. Well,
that's the thing. Like, if you go on to Twitter, where I think it's called X now, right? And you say things like that, you're going to get. I mean, I hate to say it, but the simple reality, this shouldn't be shocking to anybody. Hate's everywhere. It's everywhere. Economic hate, racial hate, all kinds of stuff. But there is definitely a them versus us mentality even today, where it was good versus evil. And there was no good, there was no evil. It was just everything all mixed up. There was a perfect storm of shit that happened in those 4-year period that led up to it too. But if when you really get into it, you know, there's no heroes with a lot of this race shit, because I can tell you in this city where I am, there's been race riots. Even in the we had the busing issue here. Whatever, when I was like in the 1970s, a long time ago, you have all this stuff going on. But in the Civil War, it was more economic driven. More than anything. You had your abolitionists here more than most places in this city, but at the same time, you also didn't have a large African-American population in Boston, like New York City. So, and that's why when we talk about the 54th Mass, they had to go outside of the state to recruit. And it wasn't because they didn't want them. They couldn't, there just wasn't that many. New York City had a whole bunch of them. We talk about those census numbers and how they really jumped in the mid 1800s. And because it was, again, part of that cotton thing. Where that was the economic, heart of the entire country. It still is. And so that's and you can see how it all goes, So
there's some good comments here. Like Ryan mentioned, the most economically insecure group, the Irish immigrants, are terrified of the only group that can work for less, which is former slaves. Peace Dems press are exploiting that fear like crazy.
That's what we talked about.
And then David said that it's because a draft riot during the Civil War in the North doesn't make the Union look good, so they decided not to teach it. 100%. There is the absolute truth. As much as it happens on one side, it happens on the other too, where you take things out because it's like, oh, this doesn't fit our narrative that we were the good side. There are people. I mean, there are generals in the Civil War fighting that, like John Reynolds, for instance. He's not an abolitionist, and neither is William Tecumseh Sherman. They're not. That's not why they're fighting.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this many, many times. I definitely don't want to end talking some racism, all that shit with this. But the thing about it though, we talked a lot about Patrick Clayburn, right? Yeah. And I've tried to say this a million times. People get it. There was a legit hatred towards the Irish here.
Miranda mentioned it, like some of the want ads said Irish need not apply.
Irish need not apply. And that's the real truth. And blacks, the Irish hated the blacks because everybody else hated the Irish. So that gave them, unfortunately, gave them a real target. Yeah. But you would talk about these Irish coming in here hand over fist in cities like Boston, Chicago, even New York City, obviously. And they were coming and working for peanuts, taking jobs. And now you got the African Americans coming.
Yeah.
And that's why we said the worst thing that ever happened to the Irish is in that period is the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah.
Because now if you're going to pay 10 cents to an Irishman, you could pay 5 cents to a black guy.
That's what Bill
right?
said. And
right.
So the peace Democrats, like especially the media, are fueling that. They are saying they're creating this fear, and they're going after the Irish specifically. They're targeting them. Oh, LC says greetings from Powers Hill.
I love Powers Hill. Powers Hill is one of those places that very few people go. It's got that nice little parking lot across the street. You can walk up and see the cannon, and it's not far from the Spangler Farm. You can walk over there too. But that's a cool place to go. And it's I bet you, besides Lost Lane, I bet you Powers Hill is the least visited place in Gettysburg, including Benner's Hill. That's saying something.
Mm-hmm.
I bet you it is. I bet you it is.
Alec mentions there were also Germans being discriminated against too. The Germans simply joined up because it was secure work, and they were really pro-union and Republican overall. And that's true. The Germans are discriminated against too. But you have, for example, you take someone like Franz Siegel, who is out, where is it, Missouri, that he's training men?
Right. St. Louis.
St. Louis, he's able to rally them. They join up the army. That's why you have the 11th Corps is primarily a German corps. And they're there fighting. Now the Irish are fighting too, obviously, on both sides. There's Germans fighting on both sides. But yeah, as Alex says, they're Republican overall. And they're coming over here. And a lot of them are post that revolution that happened.
Well, we talk about that. A lot of the Tammany Hall sponsored newspapers, they were able to preach their stuff for the Irish because they spoke English. The Germans didn't. So the Germans didn't get a lot of that media that fill in their head full of shit. That all that stuff. They didn't get that because they couldn't speak it. So that's another big part too. And that's why the Irish was so against everything that was going on, because they were reading the stuff like pablum, whereas the Germans couldn't read it.
No.
And so that was a big thing too. And so I mean the movie is a fiction movie and embellish it. But I mean, there was no coffins coming off, troops going on. That's all.
Yeah, that wasn't like that.
Right?
Same was insane.
Right. And so, but the truth of the matter is the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City, was exploiting the Irish in trying to fire their hatred up because it was all because of the votes.
Yeah.
They made sure that they took care of them because they needed the votes. Because in Tammany Hall, everybody talks about this. You can go to the 42nd monuments in New York Monument in Gettysburg and see the Indian Tamanen. It ended up there. It's I call it the Jackie Robinson Memorial because it's the 42nd New York. Yeah. But that if people who study the politics of the Civil War, especially New York politics, this was a monster. This was Chicago politics in the 1960s.
Yeah.
That's what that was. In the way the Irish politics used to run this city back in the day.
Yeah. And David mentions the book, and I've been wanting to read this one for a while. I don't know if you have, The Field of Blood, which is about the lead up to the Civil War. Yeah. I really want to read that one. Like, it's supposed to be really good. A
lot of the stories we talked about in this episode was a book by a guy named William Stoddard. It was called The Volcano Under the City. And it was written in the 1880s. And what's really good about it is we talk a lot like the Mary Chestnut Diary. It talks about the firsthand stories. Now, admittedly, some of them are embellished. They are, but all those stories we talked about, guys like Abraham Franklin, for example, they all came from this book. So if you read The Volcano Under the City, it is by far the best book on the New York draft riots, and because it talks about the lead up to it. It talks about the stories. It talks about how the city, and give New York City credit for this, because after the riots ended, a lot of the white merchants got together, very 9/11 like, and they all kind of came together as a community to support and try to bring the, allow these black businesses to come back again. They raised a lot of money to help. There was one guy who he was a black owned business on the waterfront. He had his entire business burnt down. They raised, I think it was $2,000, $3,000 somewhere in there, a lot of money at the time, and helped him build his business again. These are white New York City merchants helping these blacks help rebuild their lives afterwards. So, like I said, like 9/11, for example, New York City, they all kind of, New York's always has done good with
they
that.
Always come together. Yeah.
Right. And so it was the same thing. So a lot of the post 9/11 stuff is very reminiscent of the post New York City riot stuff. And it was no different. But that book, if you're looking for a book to read, and you can probably get on Amazon cheap, get that, because it really tells the story of what was going on in that city at that time. It's brilliant. And it's old.
I know it's an older book, right?
It was right around 1880, 1885, somewhere right around there. So it was old, but the people that Stoddard quotes and talks about are people that he talked to. So take it for a grain of salt, because the people tend to embellish, Mary. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah.
But you read it and it's tough to read. There's that story of Abraham Franklin, right? He's a 23-year-old guy. He's black. He goes into a church to pray with his mother to protect themselves for these rioters. As they're leaving, he gets jumped. They drag him to 33rd Street where his mother lives. They lynch him from a light post in front of the mother. When he's dead, an Irish guy named Patrick Butler, 16 years old, pulls his pants off, grabs him by the genitals, drags him up and down the street, his dead body, while the crowd is cheering, going crazy.
Yeah,
that's what this riot was. That's what this was, and that's why it's important to read these stories. They're tough to read, but again, the darkest part of history shows the most light on the past, right? That's why you got to read them. That's why you got to read them.
David mentions the book Civil War Awakening talks a lot about the hatred towards the 48ers, so the Germans that were involved in the revolutions. That includes, men like Franz Siegel. I think Franz Siegel is involved. Franz Siegel, von Gilsa, Schurz, Schimmelfenning, Shizanowski, all those guys that, a lot of 11th Corps guys are involved in it. And then David and Frank are talking about this 2012 TV show called Copper, which takes place in 1864 New York City, and also has callbacks to what were then the recent riots.
Yeah. I mean, you still see them mentioned here and there, but again, Gangs of New York did a really good job of showing and they call it the Irish Civil War in New York City, because the troops who came, we're talking guys that's the 69th New York, right? Yeah. These people, the 27th Indiana, you had people like that who were coming in, and at first they're firing in the sky, and they're firing blanks out of a cannon, but then they have civilians on the roofs with pistols firing on the Union troops. Finally, they say, "Fuck this!" Yeah. They start loading the cannon with canister, and they start in battle formation, linear formation, firing upon the citizens in the streets. Yeah. Gramercy Park, New York. Everybody, New York City, you'll go to Gramercy Park. That was the evening of July 16th. It was the last kind of thing. You had literal American troops firing on civilians in the street and killing them for this.
Yeah, it was really bad. Kevin mentions there's a Broadway show last year called Paradise Square that is set around the draft riots. It wasn't bad historically, but was questionable. But it did open some eyes to the draft riots. So Paul wants to know, is Stoddard one of Lincoln's secretaries?
I don't think so. I
know his secretaries were just Hay and Nicolay. I don't think so. Maybe going into his second term, he had chosen Stoddard because Hay and Nicolay weren't his secretaries for his second term.
No. So Kevin, I'll have to look at that Broadway. I assume you bought tickets to the right show for that one. I guess we'll find out later. Always check your dates, Kevin. Always check your dates.
MJ mentions these are the stories that need to get out and highlight the true history. Exactly. Like, there's some really uncomfortable history out there, but you need to talk about it. It's just like, most recently there's Atlanta campaign anniversaries have been happening. And, we did an episode most recently on Pickett's Mills, and there are some really terrible stories in that. But if you read Sherman's memoirs, Pickett's Mill doesn't exist. And that's a real, it's like, holy shit. But when you read about the battle, it's terrible. There's nothing good about that battle. And to say like, oh, well, Sherman ended up taking Atlanta, so it made the campaign worth it. Go tell that to some of the guys that were fighting there that witnessed it. It was a battle that Howard referred to as being a nightmare. And it wasn't one of his best days, but nobody talks about, that stuff. Nobody talks about the draft riots, all this stuff, especially in the North. Like the Copperhead movement is something that really fascinates me. And it's not something that's studied a lot.
Well, I mean, the thing about it, when you look at this, it's not, the red states versus the blue states. It's all dotted throughout it, and that's what's fascinating about it. Was you could have had New York City if Fernando Wood had his way, and with 16 kids, he got his way often. You could have had that city seceded.
Yeah.
Now I don't know how the hell they would have got through the blockade. They would have got cotton, but can you imagine how history might have been different? How the hell are they the New York Yankees if they seceded?
There wouldn't have been. Thomas would not have been cheering for the New York Yankees. He might be cheering for the Boston Red Sox now.
Oh, he should root for the Red Sox anyway. Why would anybody not root for the Red Sox? That's it's apple pie and Americana, Thomas. Come on.
But shockingly, Jim Miller has a book recommendation for everybody called Paradise. It says there's a book called Paradise Alley, which is the novel that this musical is based on.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. No, and so there's so much intrigue to this and so many personalities. But yeah, so the starter book is cool. It's not pro-Lincoln. That's why it's and you mentioned before about the secretary. I don't know if he was. If he was, that's news to me. But
Paul said he was. I think it was a second.
Okay, cool. That's good. That's awesome. But he clearly didn't like him. At least, or he told it like it was, because the book the book talks. We talk at the beginning of this, some of the mistakes in hindsight Lincoln made, and the book does not speak well of Lincoln. So if he was, that's awesome. That's great. It's always good to learn.
Which is the opposite to how Hay and Nicolay were. Especially, I think it was John Hay, like hero worshiped Lincoln, like he could do no wrong, and he's one of the reasons why. I mean, Hay and Nicolay are cool figures in history. David mentions he's like good friends of my colonel. He's referring to Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. But like, so Hay and Nicolay, they got together and they wrote this, I think it was Lincoln biography after Lincoln died. And it's very kind of like, I think it's hero worshipy. But I mean, the thing about them is they're kids when they're secretary for him, And like, there's that great story in Gettysburg. They go and get banged up the night before with Gettysburg Address. They go and get banged up with some reporter the night before, and they get in at like 3 a.m. And one of them has to get up and help Lincoln finish his speech in the morning. So they had to draw straws. And I think it was John Hay that had to get up, and Nicolay got to sleep in, but they were out in the town, like drinking whiskey and everything. It's a great story.
Well, they
both
obviously
AF at the speech.
They obviously went to the mine, because that's what happens. I don't think it's physically possible to leave the Reliance mine sober, right? Looking at you, MJ, just saying.
Alec mentions this, and we talked about this, I think, last week. There's a small town that seceded, and only in the 1950s they originally joined the U.S. by vote. Cannot remember the name of it, Alec. I think that's a town in upper state New York that seceded, and they were a really small town. I think MJ mentioned it last week. Where was this? So Ryan mentions for every Unionist kicking up trouble in Mississippi or Alabama, or the Germans in Texas, there's Copperheads and rebels in the North, and we've talked about that before. And then Town Line, New York, and then David Maxwell mentions First Fallen about written by Meg Ellsworth, about Ellsworth, was written by Meg Groening, who apparently, she sadly passed away.
Yeah, that's bad news. She wrote a really good book on Ellsworth. That's very sad. That's too bad.
MJ mentioned it to us the other night, and then it started going all over social media. So very sad. She passed away from cancer.
Yeah, so definitely thoughts and prayers for her family. That sucks. That fucking sucks. But no, I mean, Louisiana for the most part was a Union state towards the end. It was held. Tennessee, East Tennessee was very pro-union.
Kentucky as well.
Because that was always a border state. But I mean, as far as the true Confederate states go, my boy Benjamin Butler, good Massachusetts guy, ruled an iron fist in New Orleans, Mary. He wasn't.
G.T. Beauregard might have something to say to you about that. He hated Butler, and then so this is kind of off topic, but So after the Civil War, PGT ends up living in Louisiana. He's got some offers to go to Europe and command an army and stuff like that, and in Egypt and all this other stuff. But anyway, I guess Butler's son went after him for some stuff.
Benjamin Butler's an interesting fellow because you know what, he was somebody who was kind of the first real general. I don't know if it was the first one I could think of a credit for it, who kind of went against that Fugitive Slave Act and said, screw you, I'm not returning them. And I think that put a dent in Lincoln's dick a little bit because it forced him to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And so he ends up having to do that. Obviously, he has this history in New Orleans. And New Orleans ends up, it's funny because when you look at the post-war stuff, I think it was Military District 4. I could be wrong about the number, but I think that's what that was in Louisiana, was the guy in charge, really of the Chamber of Commerce, what they call it something different back then, in this very union-held post state, was a guy named James Longstreet. Yeah. And he pissed a lot of people off. You know what's funny? You look at the Lee versus the Longstreet debate, right? A lot of the hatred towards Longstreet comes from how he acted after the war, because he went from being very white supremacy. Yeah. His uncle Augustus, who he lived with, was a hardcore fire eater. Yeah. And by the time the war ends, he ends up taking over this government, this plum government job. He fills his staff with Black people. And that pissed a lot of people off. Then he gets basically put in charge of this militia down there. Yeah. And he puts Black officers in there. And so a lot of the hatred towards Longstreet goes back to that, with a lot of that post-war stuff. But it's just fascinating when you look at how people like him change historically. But there's a lot of very pro, even during the war, they're held, but immediately they have their head down. They're being forced down to swallow the dog with these people. But East Tennessee, Louisiana, places like that, especially New Orleans, were not Confederate friendly places, right?
No, they weren't. So David mentions that Nicolay and Hay were at the mine, and I said that needs to be a meme or a T-shirt.
I was merely at the mine to be adult supervision. That's why she's on the bar dancing It's Raining Men, right? Okay, is that what that was, MJ?
Jim Miller mentions that Benjamin Butler's ancestry goes back to Martha's Vineyard, and he happens to be a distant cousin of his.
Yeah, that's cool. He's obviously Butler has the family history with Adele Bart Ames. Speaking of Maine, the 20th Maine, the guy there was a guy in charge of the 20th who didn't have that big long mustache. I don't know if you know that, Mary.
Yeah,
and so they're related through marriage. They're buried right next to each other in Lowell, Mass. And it sucks because you can't get to their graves because it's behind this fence, and you have to kind of walk along this stone wall and and get right. But it's they don't make it.
It's blocked up.
Yeah, well, it's not the nicest neighborhood in the damn world, so it's
Yeah, David mentions that Meg Groening sent him a full copy of the Ellsworth Bill to recognize the Illinois militia, and when she learned that they was going to be betraying him, sent him a ton of Ellsworth swag.
Yeah, she was kind of the guru on Ellsworth, and there's been other books written about him, but her book I think is the best one anyway. That's really too bad. That sucks. That just sucks.
Yeah, she seemed like a really awesome person too.
I mean, I never met her. I don't know her, but I know of her obviously, and I remember I think it was Chris Makowski who first mentioned that she had died on his Facebook page. I was like,
and MJ let us know too. That's about it.
Yeah, that sucks, but unfortunately, tomorrow is promised to nobody, Mary. Live for the day. Exactly. Live for the day. Have no regrets. Don't give a shit what anybody says. You do you, right? That's the secret to life right there. That's the secret to life. So, and of course, drink your beer in the morning.
Yes, Narragansett.
We are drinking Narragansett beer right now. How about this?
They have the throwback cans from
in the 19th. Because Mary's obsessed with Jaws, and so this is 1975. They made the replica of the can that Quint broke, that he crushed. Yeah. In the movie Jaws. And so that's a big. It
crushes the styrofoam.
They make a big deal about Jaws here, the movie, and so Narragansett out of Providence, Rhode Island, is coming out with these old cans in the movie. So we had to buy a 12-pack.
Yeah, it's actually decent beer.
It's okay. It's okay for God's sakes, but it's fine.
Mind it. I like it.
Yeah,
it's decent beer.
No, it definitely is. It definitely is. But when you look at these draft rights, and what's interesting about New York City now is when you look at the demographics of the city, the drafts riots affected the city, because New York City at the time, Manhattan, went just a little bit north of where Central Park is right now.
Yeah.
Right. And so a lot of the blacks got out of Manhattan and they went into Brooklyn, and they went into a place called Harlem. And they kind of all congregated there. And that's why you have like a black Harlem today. When you go to Harlem, which is a really cool place to go, it's very pretty. If you go and you see that high African-American population, it's because of the draft riots. They went to get the hell out of Dodge, and they're still there.
Yeah. So Elsie said he had a few too many Narragansetts last night, and I asked him, did he go full Quint?
The question for you, Elsie, is do you get the old cans, the 75 cans from the movie? Let's see if you're cool if you can get those, right?
David mentions there's a recent biography of Butler that is really good. I think I've seen that one on our friend Bjorn over at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. I'm pretty sure they sell that. I can't remember what the name of it is or the author, but I do remember them talking about that book. MJ said it's really a Vienna lager.
Vienna lager. Gentili, I'm mad at him because he's not coming on our live because he's watching some stupid soccer game right now.
Oh,
I'm not really mad at him, but it's just he's watching that stupid thing. So, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah, David said he was able to bounce a bunch of ideas off of Meg and ask her a ton of questions. She was really great and very excited about me portraying him. See, that's what awesome. Like when you can talk with historians about stuff like that, like authors, and we've had quite a few of them on our book club as well. Like one of my favorites was Tim Smith, to talk about his book about the real horse soldiers. Like he just brought that story to life. And there was someone that asked a question, and it was something he hadn't been able to put in the book, but he wanted to. And he was like, I'm so glad you asked that question. And then he said something like, it got me laughing really hard, was he's like, yeah, they need to sell a bobblehead of Pemberton in the Vicksburg gift shop.
No kidding.
That was so good when he said that.
No, but, Tim Smith was cool. This isn't Tim Smith and Battlefield Trust. This is a different Tim. This is the author Tim Smith.
It's Western Theater.
Right. And we had him on for a book club to talk about that Horse Soldiers book. And that's fascinating because the Ben Grierson story is really something.
But you can tell Ben Grierson is his guy, right?
And Cavalry gets the shit into the stick on the northern side a lot. And that's because you had people like Jeb Stuart, John Hunt Morgan, who's the anniversary of his capture, which is a couple of days ago. But you have some good Union cavalry guys too. And we just don't mean Miranda's guy, Sheridan. We mean other people too. Sheridan. I don't dislike Sheridan.
Sheridan is like, you put it so perfectly. It's like, he's like you buy a lottery ticket 10 times and you only win once, and then it's like, oh, I better buy more. It's like Sheridan, like how many good things did he do?
I mean, I will freely say though that Phil Sheridan is probably the single most overrated person in the Civil War.
I would agree.
Not even a question. To go along with Stonewall Jackson, by the way.
I would agree with that. And by saying they're underrated does not mean they suck, although I think Sheridan does. Not really, but anyway, I'm just pissed off at what he did to Gouverneur K. Warren. It doesn't mean I don't think Stonewall Jackson sucks, but there's tons of other guys that did more than Jackson.
Well, that whole thing was, speaking of sharks, that's what that was. It was ape predators. You saw what Grant did to Rosecrans, right?
Oh yeah, you had to be the apex predator. And my favorite cavalry guy, and it's because of you, and then it's because of you and a few other people like Gentili as well. Like just talking to the two of you about Mosby. He's become one of my favorites. And we actually, there's sharks again. There's this Sharktivity app that we have, and it shows where the sharks are. And there's been one shark that has been in Plymouth Bay every so often, and then he'll go away for a few days and he'll come back. So we've named him Mosby.
Yeah.
Sometimes Mosby appears. He hasn't appeared for a few days, so we're waiting for him to.
Oh, John Mosby is one of those colorful characters who just unfortunately, he wrote that fantastic memoirs that a lot of people who hate on Jeb Stuart from Gettysburg have apparently not read, Mary, because it tells it really absolves Jeb at Gettysburg in a lot of ways. Yeah. Admittedly, John Mosby also had a man crush on Jeb Stuart.
Oh,
but admittedly, he was his mentor. He was part of the run around McClellan. He was part of that. but everything that Mosby learned cavalry wise came from Jeb, and he added on to it like most people do, but he definitely liked himself some Jeb, but when he really does a good job defeating that narrative of the whole Jeb was running around the North getting his name in the papers.
Yeah.
Right. That really kind of came out of a lot of the Walter Taylor, Charles Marshall post Gettysburg stories to absolve Lee from Gettysburg, and that stuck. And unfortunately, Michael Schar put that in the book, and then of course it ended up in the movie. And you still see the memes today with Jeb.
It's like, oh gosh, just read what Mosby wrote. Jim Miller mentions, and this is very true. Sheridan saves Rosecrans' ass at Stones River. Stones River is probably his best day in the Civil War, I would think.
For Mosby?
No, Sheridan. Jim Miller mentions Sheridan saved Rosecrans' ass at Stones River. That's one of
he did.
That's one of his best days in the Civil War.
Well, when you're talking Sheridan, he's got really has only three, right? He's got Cedar Creek, right?
Yep.
He's got Stones River, and he's got Jeb.
Yep.
He's got Yellow Tavern. But the thing
about even then, Yellow Tavern is one of those things where it's like, how do I make up for the bad stuff I've done? I'm going to go.
Well, that's the thing is that he screws up a lot. And his hatred, we mentioned the crush that Mosby had on Jeb, his hatred for all things George Meade really exposed the Union heading into Spotsylvania. Because yes, it was great that he went off to go chase Jeb. If you're a Union guy, you go to chase Jeb Stuart, but you lost 10,000 men to get him. And that's not, and that when you factor the deaths of Yellow Tavern and the Spotsylvania, don't forget too, for whatever reason, Grant says, you know what, take your entire cavalry and leave as we're coming out of the wilderness and this Overland campaign, but just go, and I'm going to be blind and leave guys like Hancock and Barlow to hold their dicks in the wind and hope we don't get our asses kicked because I want you to get away from Meade. So that's where the politics and the personal stuff comes into this, and how lucky, right? That's true though. It is true.
Yeah, and I mean, with the one really telling thing was the book by Chris Makowski and he talks about Stuart's death, and he just says, was Jeb's death really worth all the casualties that they had in the Union? Because at that point, Jeb is kind of losing his fastball a little bit. He's not the Jeb that he was, when he's riding around McClellan, right? Like Jeb is great, but I do think in some ways he's overrated. Mosby's my favorite. Mosby by far is my favorite cavalry guy.
Well, Jeb had that cult of personality where, and it's not Jeb did a lot of good things. He did. Speaking of Spotsylvania, what Jeb Stuart did leading into the Battle of Spotsylvania, in my opinion, not fact, was his greatest moment. And I'm just saying, because what he did is he dismounted his cavalry to help slow down the Union army so Lee could get to Spotsylvania. Now, Lee screwed that whole thing up by pulling the guns away, right? Yeah. But you could have had a situation there where you could have had the Confederates messed up right off the bat, and it would have opened the door to Meade and for Grant to force Lee out at Spotsylvania Courthouse to get pounded, because Lee still thought that he was chasing Richmond. But if Jeb doesn't slow them down, you talk about Buford a lot with Gettysburg, right? If Jeb does the same damn thing. And if he doesn't do that, the war probably ends a lot earlier. So I think that's his best moment, personally.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. No.
Yeah. Wow, that's true.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
They're talking about, let me go. There's some good comments here. People are having some really good discussions. Ryan, now you're abusing Sheridan. This is a knock. Let's knock the Irish episode. Sheridan sucked me. Marr was a drunk. Claiborne was a reb. Louisiana Tigers were discipline immune. David said no disparaging Claiborne ever. And then MJ mentions too many base their knowledge on Jeb Stuart, but the movie. But yeah, Claiborne is like the whole thing with playing the draft riots and seeing how the Irish are treated. It made me, think more like Claiborne must have had to work that much harder to get to where he even got because of the Irish thing. But,
of course he did.
But then Simmons does mention in his biography about him that Claiborne did his best to hide his accent too.
Why the hell do you think he couldn't get into pharmacy school in the North in friggin' Ohio?
Well, he couldn't speak Latin for one.
Well, right, but I mean, that was, he had one strike against him anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, who the hell wants to go to college in Ohio anyway? I don't blame him for that.
He moves to Arkansas.
I mean, it goes all the way to Arkansas for that. But seriously, it's some of these prejudices and these bigoted decisions, they affected history. They really did.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole war was obviously, it was obviously racially tinged, economically tinged, but just speaking to these draft riots that we just did the thing on.
Yeah.
That was when economics and racism meet, and you have the media and politicians fanning the flames so they can sit back and watch everyone fight while they collect all the money. Because the people who benefited from the Civil War, they love these riots because they were able to just sit there. If it's like George Carlin used to say, that politicians nowadays want people fighting because they can sit back and take all the money. And that's the same. It's the same deal.
That's what they were doing in Gangs of New York. You see it in Gangs of New York. Like, that's what they were like. You could see Tammany doing that. You could see Bill the Butcher doing that. Like, they were all getting them to fight. MJ mentions Plenty of Blame to Go Around by Eric Wittenberg is a great book that kind of debunks the whole Jeb Stuart myth from Gettysburg.
Eric's a good dude because he is someone who doesn't buy into the Jeb shit,
the mythology,
and so the thing about it though is it doesn't take a lot of research to debunk it.
But people just like, they love what they see in the movie, and I mean the movie's great, but there's so much not right about the movie.
The Jeb Stuart thing is very similar to the Lost Order 191 thing, where if you just simply look at a couple of primary sources, it debunks all of it, but no one does.
Yep.
Right. It's the headline versus the comment section, right?
Yep.
Where if you just sit back and you look at Lost Order 191 from McClellan, and you just look at the Nathan Kimball story, it debunks everything that Stephen Sears says, all of it. Yep. But Stephen Sears said it, so that goes in the historical narrative. The Jeb Stuart thing, because of everything that happened with that gets the historical narrative, and you debunk the stuff completely that's said by John Mosby, who breaks it down clearly of what Stuart's actual orders were in the Gettysburg campaign, which was not to report back. It was simply to stay on Ewell's right and help get supplies.
Yep, and that's what he did.
So in the movie, when he says, when Martin Sheen says, those wagons are useless to me now, or I think that's what he says.
Yeah.
But it's unfair to him. It's unfair to Jeb. It really is, because he was doing what he was supposed to do.
Yeah, that's what David mentions. He says the love was not only Lee, but Jeb's subordinates had for him or all the evidence people should need. So referring to Mosby, like Jeb was following orders, and then Longstreet did nothing wrong to be vilified.
Well, Jeb, the thing about it though, Jeb took his boys with him, and the people he hated, right? Like guys like Jenkins, he left with Lee. Grumble Jones, right? Those guys, he took his primary dudes. So the people he took were less qualified, but he liked them. The people he left with Lee were more qualified, but he didn't like them. So there's personalities that affect all this stuff.
Yeah. And Ryan mentions that Claiborne served in a Welsh regiment, so maybe he might have had a bit of a Welsh accent too when he was in the British Army. So who knows? Elsie mentioned Mosby's great wagon train raid was right near where he used to teach in Berryville, Virginia. And then Mosby captured 200 beef cattle, 500 to 600 horses, 100 wagons, and 200 soldiers.
My favorite Mosby story, everyone talks about the Stoughton story, and that's a cool story too, when he whacked him in the ass and said that whole
is such a great story.
But my favorite John Mosby story is a story where they blow up the train line and the train goes off the track. And I think it was in Warrenton, Virginia. I could be wrong in the location, but I think it's Warrenton, Virginia. And the train goes off the track and it's filled with Union Irish troops who are coming to fight for the Union. And they're all jumping off the train, and they're all, I don't think there was even any deaths at this, but they just derailed the train. And he caught he found this one guy who was like an officer. And he said, he basically, kind of like the movie, why are you fighting this war? Yep. Right. And the Irish guy goes, to learn how to be what war is like, how to be a soldier. And then like an hour later, the same guy walks up to Mosby complaining. He's just wearing his underwear. And he says to him, your men stole my clothes. And Mosby looks at him and he says, well, you said you wanted to learn about war. Well, there's your first lesson. it's just a great story. That's
so good.
But that's who Mosby was. He had a good, solid sense of humor.
Yeah.
But that's what he was, though.
But he
that's
treated but I think he treated the Union guys like if they were prisoners, he didn't treat them terribly. He was like Claiborne in that regard. Like
he was
treated the Union guys very respectfully.
Claiborne was Mosby was very much like John Hunt Morgan. It was a game. He'd bag the guys, he'd slap them in the ass a little bit, then he'd send them home.
Literally.
That's what he did. He wasn't a situation where he was killing them or shooting them, or no. It was just because they realized that if you're John Mosby and your entire group is in the shadows, you can't carry around a bunch of prisoners. You got to get rid of them anyway. But for these guys, I don't want to say it was a game, but it was catching sharks here. You catch it, you tag it, and you let it go.
Yeah.
But you caught them, and they know that you were caught.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he wasn't someone who massacred people or killed people. And truth be told, Sheridan really didn't either.
No.
He had his burning of the valley thing, but he was
sitting with a cigar and
yes.
People's houses burned and stuff. I mean, what he did in the valley I get why people are pissed off about it. Frank said, "Are you telling me the Gettysburg movie is not accurate? Now you'll tell me that Buster wasn't real and that there were no Confederate pickets."
Is there going to be a disturbance in our town? The director's cut is so cringeworthy on certain scenes. But the only scene that Gettysburg director's cut they should have left in was when Lee was talking to Robert Rhodes and those guys. He should have left that scene in.
Because he's like, I watched it with a friend of mine, and they had seen the original, right? And then they saw that and they were like, now it makes so much more sense.
The scene that when Buford comes into town and he rides to the cemetery and then he talks to the mayor and he talks, it's just so bad. But they took that scene out. So it turns out that the director's daughter in the final version has the only line in the movie by a female.
Yeah.
When she says, "I thought the war was in Virginia." That's the only female line in the entire final one, except for the director's cut. But the director's cut has good scenes, but those scenes are freaking terrible.
Oh,
it just is.
They are. Yeah. But that I hate that they took the Rhodes Ewell early scene because that was really good. It helped explain so much. Ryan says Buster was real. Stop minimizing the heroes of my culture.
Well, the truth of the matter is, and also there were thousands of Busters.
And that's what he is.
And so Buster represents. I mean, his physical name was obviously not real, but there were so many Busters in the American Civil War. We said before, 1 in every 4 Union soldiers was foreign. A lot of Irish, a lot of Germans, even some Canadians, but there were Busters. There were. But again, it's a fun thing we talk about with that, and that's one of those things in the movie,
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. And getting to kind of the historical narrative and things like Order 191 and all that. We saw that when we did our episode about Howard, just how the narrative for him is mostly Howard sucks, and then you go into this whole his career in the Western Theater and what he did after the war, and. Like I said, Lincoln Memorial University, which he helped found, they were really nice and sent us a few documents that we requested. One of them was about Howard's widow after after he passed away and all the stuff that she went through. His funeral, basically the program from his funeral, we have that, as well as a couple other things, which was really cool that they sent us that. But it turned even I noticed researching that episode just how complex of a character he is. And he's been reduced to this guy that basically his reputation is he runs. And there's so much more to him than that. Kind of there's all this mythology around Jeb Stuart as well. It's interesting how stuff suddenly becomes it's gospel.
Yeah, sure.
Alex got a question. Who do you think are the great working relationships of the war on both sides? And he says, for me, it's Rosecrans and Thomas, and then Lee and Longstreet.
I mean, I think Grant and Sherman's got to be the best, in my opinion, on the Union side, because they just did their thing. The Longstreet Lee thing is a little bit overrated. That's the thing about that was, Longstreet, when Stonewall Jackson died after Chancellorsville, he assumed he was going to be his right-hand man. There's that whole thing, he was Lee's war horse and all that. But Lee made it very clear to him that he was a subordinate. And so, and a lot of that stuff came out of that, but that was a good working relationship. I think There's a lot of them, though. I mean, on the Confederate side, it's really tough to say.
I know. I'm trying to think of a Confederate, but I do agree with Alec about Rosecrans and Thomas is one of those underrated ones that they had a really good working
if you want to talk about Longstreet, his best working relationship was probably E.P. Alexander. Believe it or not,
yeah,
that was probably the best one as far as because they really stuck to each other all the way through. I think Grant Sherman would probably be the northern one. The southern one is tough though, because a lot of the southern ones, their closest friends were northerners. We talk about Longstreet. One of his closest friends was Grant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about Winnie Boy Hancock. He was very close with Harry Heath.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it was cross-pollination with that stuff. Believe it or not, the Winnie Armistead thing isn't as accurate as people think it is.
Yeah. And I think for the South, though, I think Cleburne and his subordinates.
Well, Cleburne and Thomas Hinman was a good one.
Yeah, but Cleburne and his other Hinman, as well as
well, how about Hardee? How about Hardee and Cleburne?
Yeah, like they worked so well together. But you look at like all the shit that Cleburne's able to accomplish because of his subordinates, because he's got Granbury, because he's got Hinman, because he's got Lucius Polk. These guys that are strong fighters, and he puts his best in at Pickett's Mill. He puts his best in at what's it called, Ringgold Gap, as well, and he keeps doing it. And I think some of those relationships are really something that the relationship Cleburne had with his subordinates is exactly why he had the success he had, or one of the reasons.
I mean, you can make a case, and for whatever you think, no one's going to tell you wrong, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah, Alec just said he agreed with you. Hardee and Cleburne, good point. Yeah,
Hardee and Cleburne's a good one. And it was almost like The Odd Couple. You had the party boy Hardee with kind of the awkward Cleburne.
And Hardee kept inviting him to stuff, and Cleburne was like, "No, I can't go." But because of Hardee, Cleburne meets the love of his life, Sewell Tarleton.
I would go Hardee Cleburne as I think about it now for the South. I think I would, and I think you have to go Grant Sherman for this year. I think you have to, because that was pretty legit.
I do see Thomas and Rosecrans as another one as well that doesn't get looked at a lot.
Well, don't forget too. I was going to say Rosecrans. You know, he has a good relationship there. Looking back with a lot of these people as well. The thing with Rosecrans with Thomas was they were both hated by Grant. Or distrusted by Grant, so there was kind of a mutual admiration society with that.
Admiration society.
Well, I mean, it kind of was though. But that's a great question though, because it makes you think.
That's really good. Yeah, it makes you think like, whoa, like, and yeah, I definitely.
And another one, in all seriousness, is Joseph Hooker and Daniel Butterfield. That's what
someone just said. Right? So Ryan said that, and David Maxwell said Hooker and Butterfield. The Dang Barn Triple X Corps.
I mean, Butterfield was so instrumental with Hooker's army that Meade kept him on, even though we hated Butterfield.
Yeah, but Butterfield.
I don't know if you know this, but he wrote bugle calls.
Yeah.
But that's the truth though, because he knew that Butterfield knew where all the bodies were buried. He knew where the corps were. So when Meade takes over, knowledge is power. Hooker never told Meade where the hell the corps were. No. So he has to have Butterfield kind of deal with that. So but these are all relationships by convenience, though, in a lot of cases. But a lot of the true friendships went north and south, back and forth.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And we talked about that in our episode about Howard. I talked about that on Facebook on my Instagram page about how one of the friendships is between Stephen D. Lee and Howard, and they don't even realize they're fighting against each other at Ezra Church. The anniversary was just the other day. It's been 159 years since that. But they had this friendship and they didn't know they were fighting against each other. There's some other, Elsie said a park ranger stopped to check on me for parking at Powers Hill, and he apologized and said, no one parks here.
Elsie, please tell me you park in the designated parking spot across the street, because I guarantee you were the only car there. So I hope.
Yeah, that's what that ranger said. They came to check on him.
Make sure he was okay.
Nobody ever parks there.
Dude, you're at Powers Hill. Are you okay? Is something wrong with you?
Yeah, like, why are you here? You must be really into this. Ryan said Sheridan and his boy toy Custer.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, Custer, geez, that
MJ said Stonewall and Garnett didn't make the list.
No, that was under consideration. That was a good one. Stonewall had a legit hate for him. He really did. Well, I mean, but see, you look at the Battle of Kernstown, and you're sending out, You're sending, Garnet out for that battle, and you get beat by Nathan Kimball, and you're Stonewall, and you're back with the 8th Virginia in the back, just chilling, and Garnet has to retreat. You need to find a fall guy, and you need to find someone to blame. And Stonewall never got over that. He never did, because he loses a battle in the Valley, which he wasn't used to losing. Stonewall was a little bit of a diva. He threatened to resign. Sure. I mean, that was always unfair for Garnet. That really, really was.
Yeah. Oh, it's David mentions too that the Grant Sherman relationship was portrayed really well in the Shaw Western Theater series, which it was. The other relationship, and I just, was thinking about this too, is what, and it's the one you mentioned, is the Hardy-Clayburn relationship is portrayed really well in The Smoke at Dawn. Mm-hmm. It's just in one book, but then you realize how close they were in one of the opening chapters of book 4, which is about the March to the Sea, and Hardy is reading the news about what happened to Clayburn at Franklin. Right. And then Frank said Clayburn and Hardy, as well as their partners, were all dead by 1875.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. So a lot of the stories, who knows what really happened, but there's some good stories from Hardy picking up women. Yep. With Clayburn, and Clayburn kind of screwing that whole thing up for him.
He was like the awkward nerd of he was so awkward with women.
Well, yeah, he was. I mean, don't forget too, by then he had a bullet in his face, right?
Yeah, so he's scarred. But that's why, but didn't you say Hardy was Kramer wearing the pimp suit?
Yeah, that's kind of. I mean, Hardy was. There's a few of these guys. Another guy who was a very underrated, Lothario, is Allegheny Johnson. I mean, this is a guy from the Rarely Wore Pants Society too. He's another one. When he gets injured, yes, they call him Old Clubby because he has to carry that club around. He's back rehabbing, and he's having a good time. And so there's a lot of guys like that who took advantage of that general officer status. Yeah. And he finally gets back with Spotsylvania. He gets caught and he's swinging his club. He's, it's like the scene from, Anchorman, the big fight there. But yeah, he's another one, but there's a lot of those. But the Clayburn Hardy one was kind of like an odd couple, mentor protege type thing, where I think Hardy knew Clayburn was the goods. Yeah. And so he wanted to help culture him. He also got him away from Hinman.
Yeah.
So Hinman, I mean, Clayburn was the responsible one. Hinman was a wild guy. Hinman got Clayburn shot one time when they were young.
Yeah, and I think, wasn't Hinman the one that Clayburn almost killed when he woke him up when he was drunk?
Yeah, and Hinman was a wild man.
Yeah.
And so he was able to get Clayburn away from Thomas Hinman. And so he helped try to nurture him a little bit. So I think Hardy looked at him as kind of like his protege and vice versa. But even eventually Hardy had said enough of this and he had to leave. But I would go with that one for the sub. That's a
that is a really good one. It's one that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I mean, my second one would just be just Clayburn and all his subordinates, the relationship he had with them, the fact that he trusted them. He was able to utilize them really well during battles like Ringgold Gap and Pickett's Mills. And they were all really talented guys. Like you have Leon, I think his subordinates were Granbury, Hinman, right, and then Leonidas Polk, the nephew of
right. It was most Hinman kind of stayed in the back on that one.
Yeah.
Hiram Granbury and Leonidas Lucius Polk were the two big ones.
Well, Granbury was like his pit bull. Like he was go do it, Granbury.
Granbury was a tough prick. There's no question he was. Yeah. He was a solid wind him up and let him go, rock him, sock him, robot type guy. Kind of like a more, I don't want to say more responsible John Brown Gordon. I guess it would be. I guess that's a good description. Or Hood, probably a better one. John
what's Hood really? Here's one. Hood's relationship with Davis is exactly how he got command.
I was going to say that was one of the ones I originally thought about was the relationship with that, but that was more of a political one. They weren't like in the field together or stuff like that. But you could have a lot of that stuff.
Patrick said, "Where is Garnet buried? Any place you want him to be?" He's probably buried in Richmond. Actually, there's that monument in Richmond.
We went to Hollywood Cemetery there, and and so there's a monument for him there with all the Confederate dead at Gettysburg. He's probably buried unknown somewhere in there. But the reality is, if he was shot the way the stories say he could be everywhere. There's probably bone fragments still at Gettysburg.
Yeah, because he was probably vaporized. That's what they suspect.
Yeah.
So Frank mentions my favorite Allegheny Johnson story is when he was caught after Nashville because he ran away too slow, huffing and puffing, and the federals caught up to him.
Yeah, that's why it's important to get your cardio. A lot of these guys with that. Allegheny Johnson.
Isn't that what happened to Bishop Polk?
Yeah, exactly.
He couldn't get away fast enough from the cannon.
I mean, Allegheny Johnson is a fascinating study. Most people associate him with just Culp's Hill and Gettysburg, but his Spotsylvania story was really when he was at his peak.
Mm-hmm.
That was I think his best moment because he had the most responsibility. Admittedly, it was a situation where he lost all of his guns when Ewell's guns got taken away by Lee, and he was stuck out there. But he was literally, if you've been to Spotsylvania, he's on those breastworks, standing there, swinging his club like a baseball bat at the Confederates before he gets captured. And so you can't say anything. You can't say he was running away because he was a brave prick, but he was a big fan of the ladies. This guy.
Yeah, the one you thought would have been a big fan of the ladies but wasn't was Bushrod Johnson.
Yeah, he had a good name for it, but he just didn't.
You researched him for our Alcohol in the Civil War episode. You're like, wow, this guy was pretty straight laced.
He actually was. Again, I don't think those nicknames and what is appropriate back then as far as how it is now. But yeah, exactly. That and A.M. Sterling Wood are the best.
Wasn't it Sterling A.M. Wood?
Sterling A.M. Wood, yeah, from Shiloh. Well, that's a great name.
Well, I think it's P. Ridge. Sterling A.M. Wood and Bushrod Johnson are next to each other in battle formation.
Exactly. From the Brazzers Brigade,
David said Hood, and my vacation is ruined. I was reading I'm still finishing the Beauregard. We call him Beauregard on here because beer. Mm-hmm. But I got to the part where it's like late 1864 and Davis is just shuffling him around by this point. So he kind of puts him in charge of Hood, except he's not really in charge of Hood. So the whole time, Beauregard is trying to keep Hood in line. And Hood is writing to Richmond, and Davis is telling him, no, you can do that. And then he's not telling Beauregard. So Beauregard goes to have a come to Jesus chat with him. And he's like, you need to tell me what you're doing because we have to set up your supply lines. And then so Hood is like, here's the deal. I'm going to go into Tennessee, and then I'm going to kick their ass. And then I'm going to go meet Lee in Virginia. And by this point, Beauregard is like, yeah, this sounds really crazy, but you do you.
Well, there's a lot. We mentioned Longstreet a while ago. I mean, when he went off to fight the Battle of Knoxville, when it was Game of Thrones there, when they just put water down the ramparts and it froze over, they couldn't get up the damn wall. And then Longstreet loses and says, "Fuck this! I'm staying in winter quarters. I'm not going back to this."
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of stories like that.
Yeah,
there's a lot of them like that.
But the thing is Hood, Beauregard is trying to figure out what Hood's doing, and Hood's not communicating it with him after he gets this kind of. It's basically he's not doing anything. Beauregard's told, if you go see Hood, you can't take charge of his army, even though you outrank him. You can't take charge of his army. Right. So if you go on the field with him, you can't take charge of his army. And then so they set up this supply base for him. And then Beauregard doesn't hear from him. And then he finds out through the newspapers that he's somewhere else in Tennessee. And Beauregard's like, what the hell? We now have to move your supply base. Can you please keep in touch with me? But he does think Hood's plan is crazy. But he's like, well, if I say no, they're going to do it anyway. So I'm just going to be like, fine, you go do the best you can. And that's when Franklin and Nashville happens. Beauregard is his commanding officer technically on paper. But what's actually happening is Hood is writing directly to Richmond, directly to Jeff Davis, and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. And Davis is telling him, dude, you do you. You go and get them. And that's why Franklin happens, because Beauregard doesn't really have that say in it at all. He has to sign off on it. He's like, fine, you can do your little thing in Tennessee. If I say no, you're going to do it anyway, because Davis is going to tell you to do it. But Beauregard is so frustrated with him. And I found myself reading that chapter and I was getting really frustrated with it. I'm like, this guy does it. And it shows really what the administration was like at that point and just how it was crumbling. at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean that whole thing was kind of like Kevin Bacon in Animal House yelling all is well, and he's trying to keep it all together, and Hood knows that he's put in charge after Atlanta because he's aggressive, and Davis makes it very clear to him because like you said, Hood's been going up the back stairs trying to get that job forever. He finally gets the job at Army of Tennessee, and he knows he has to be aggressive. And so that's what happens. You end up with Ezra Church, you end up with Spring Hill, you end up with Franklin, you end up with Nashville, because that's who he was, and that's where his marching orders were. He's like Rudy in that movie, right? He has to be that way because if he doesn't do it, he ain't going to be doing the job anymore. Yeah. So he knows he has to.
But the thing is I think it was his idea, at least according to this biography I'm reading about Beauregard, it was Hood's idea to go into Tennessee and do what he did. And Beauregard is supposed to be his commanding officer, but he can't, it's kind of like Beauregard's like, if I say no, you're going to do it anyway, because I know you're communicating with Jeff Davis and that's who you're really taking your orders from. It's kind of like if you think of a Union general who has a commanding officer over him, and that Union general is communicating directly with Abraham Lincoln and not taking orders from his so-called commanding officer.
That's true.
And Beauregard is trying to tell him, I think your plan to go into Tennessee is nuts, but we'll give it we'll give it a try. David said, if I could travel in time and change something, I might go to Hood quarters at Rippavilla and make sure Claiborne and those other generals and men didn't die uselessly at Franklin.
Yeah, well, that's never going to that wasn't going to happen. I mean, the reality is these guys are going to do orders. I mean, maybe you go back in time, you go to Spring Hill, right? You tell guys like Breckinridge and those guys to pay more attention.
Yeah.
Because if they fight Schofield there and slow them down, Franklin's probably not necessary, right? Yeah. And that's the whole thing. And so that whole Franklin thing is something, because I mean it's an important battle, it's a huge battle, but at the end of the day, it's unnecessary because of the mistakes that were made. Every battle leads for something. Franklin happens because of Spring Hill. Yeah. Gettysburg happens probably because of Second Winchester, right? Realistically. Yeah. So it kind of all goes hands in hand. But yeah, I mean, again, these guys are going to do what they're told. Yeah. After Schofield gets by them at Spring Hill, don't forget, I mean, Hood's pretty embarrassed at this point.
Oh yeah. And he's embarrassed. I need people to blame.
So he knows that he's got his dander up, that he has to fight. He's going to fight Opdyke's guys right at that angle. And you're going to end up with John Adams and Arthur Strahl and Claiborne and Gist and Claiborne, all those guys, Granbury, all getting killed because he knew he had to be aggressive because of what happened at Spring Hill, right? Yeah. And he also knew that he had to keep Schofield from getting into Nashville. Yeah. But at that point, the horses are out of the barn. So why?
But the whole thing is that what you've always said about anything after Atlanta is useless. I've always agreed with you on that, but I agree even more now that I've read what was going on from what was happening with Beauregard. He's put in this position where he's overseeing the department that Hood is in. So technically he should be the one approving the orders, right. But it's not. He's finding out, through newspapers and then later on where Hood is, because Hood is communicating directly with Jefferson Davis and Richmond. And that's where he's taking his orders from. So because they're not, and so Beauregard basically Hood would move his men somewhere and Beauregard would have to go talk to him and be like, well, I guess this is how it is now. So we'll set you up a supply base here, but please make sure you tell me next time you're going to move. So I know to move the supply base. And Hood just never really did that. And the other thing too, is going into this Tennessee campaign that Hood does, a lot of the men didn't have shoes. The army of Tennessee was not in good shape.
No, that's the truth. And you got to remember the timing too. We're talking winter time. Yeah. And so if you really want to read about a lot of misery in the Civil War, read about the Army of Tennessee's march back after Nashville, because you're kind of doing the Lee retreat, but it's in the snow. Mm-hmm. These guys have no shoes and
you don't have the supplies.
And what sucks too is if you're an Army of Tennessee guy and you make it back healthy and you're still standing, they shipped your ass to North Carolina to fight with Joseph Johnson.
And you got to fight Bentonville. And Joseph Johnson is the one that takes over anyway. In the end, he comes back in.
So it's ironic. It's kind of like how we talk about the 27th Indiana with this draft riot. After Gettysburg, they're part of that, the attack on Lower Culp Hill on early July 3rd. Yeah. They get massacred along with the 2nd Massachusetts under Charles Mudge. They're the ones who part of the groups who have to come back and fight these riots. So some of these guys firing on the troops were Silas Cosgrove's guys.
Yeah.
Who just went through hell at Gettysburg, but now they'd have to go into New York City to fire on Northern residents to put down a riot. I mean, you just goes to what's going on in their minds. Some of these people, what the hell they were thinking, right?
Oh yeah, it's it's not a good situation all around. I mean, I feel really, and then so after all this stuff happens in Tennessee, Beauregard suddenly starts getting letters from Hardee, and then he ends up going to Savannah, and Hardee is just like, dude, we just need to abandon this. Like, we can't fight. We don't have let's just go. And Beauregard agrees with him and says, yeah, let's just abandon it. Beauregard didn't really, I don't think he wanted to, but he saw Hardee's point of view that we can't keep doing this. We just have to let Sherman have it. Like, Hardee was one of these guys that knew it was up.
No,
he knew the writing was on the wall with it.
Hardee finally gave it the old quit and said, the hell with this. Yeah. That's because the generals knew. They knew that the ship was over. They knew it was done. It was the politicians who looking to save their own skin, who wanted to keep it going, because the longer the war was going, the longer they were still on this side. Well, that's why
Davis was okaying Hood's orders, Davis was okaying Hood's orders, and David Maxwell mentions that during the Tennessee campaign that Hood undertakes, he's not all there, his injury has really done him in. I think a lot of his injury was playing into how he was as a commander. He's not. I think he's given up the laundrum by that point. But I think he's having effects from his injury. And that's why he's not on the field at Ezra Church.
Well, it wasn't, that the laundromat, his body was falling. He couldn't physically get on a horse.
No.
He was, but that's the whole thing. I'm not sure what difference that would have made anyway. Let's be honest, you get beat by Howard. It's like losing to Stevie Wonder at checkers.
Howard did beat Stephen D. Lee, who was.
I know.
Stephen D. Lee was his own campaign manager on Tupelo.
He was,
and it really wasn't.
The hero of Tupelo, Stephen D. Lee.
It wasn't a victory. David said Hood should have stayed a division commander.
Well, everyone has their glass ceiling. We talk about this quite a bit. Hood, if you look at Hood, and Hood pre-July 1st, 1863 was pretty legit. I mean, he was. Yeah. And even after that, he had his moments, Chickamauga notwithstanding, but his body was falling apart as he was going. I mean, it was like just picture a shitty old 1978 Chevy Nova with the parts falling off as you're driving up 128 Massachusetts.
Is it that car from
Plains? Which I've done.
No, the car from Plains, Trains, and
I had a Tweety Bird yellow Chevy Nova, and I was driving up 128 Massachusetts. Literally, his parts were falling off of it. That was Hood.
Is that the Army of Tennessee in 1864?
It was. That was headed to Bentonville. It absolutely was in North Carolina. But I mean that's what he was though. Is he was falling apart. But he was legit though. He was.
There's a lot of these guys that were good and then they get injured, and unfortunately their injuries take something away from them. Unfortunately, like Hancock is one of them. But then you have other guys that, yes, Howard loses his arm. It's not as a horrific injury as happens to some of them, but he bounces back pretty quickly from it. But you have these guys that even if they aren't injured, they do have a ceiling with how good they are. And then if you put them in higher command, it's like, ooh, we shouldn't have put you there. Howard is the opposite of Hood in the sense that he's learning from his mistakes. He becomes a legit Army commander. He's really good in command of the Army of the Tennessee. And no one studies that aspect about him. And, then you have him on the March to the Sea. And after the Civil War, Sherman and Slocum would often go to plays together, and Howard would always sit on Sherman's right side and Slocum would sit on his left side. Mm-hmm. And that was, obviously deliberate. Sherman insisted upon that, that his two commanders sit on either side of him, the ones from the March to the Sea. But there's someone like Hood that, whether it's his injuries, we don't know for sure. If he had not been injured, maybe he would have been a better commander, but I don't know,
Yeah, it's hard to say. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Elsie asked, how did the Army of Tennessee get to North Carolina?
They marched.
They
marched to Corinth, Mississippi. They took a train from Corinth somewhere east that I cannot remember, but they dropped off and they marched the rest of the way. But they walked to Corinth. They got a train from Corinth. They went east, and I forget where they got dropped off because I haven't thought about this in forever. But that's how they got there. And they took most of their trip was a train ride, admittedly.
And they also they were fed into, other corps and divisions in Joseph E. Johnson's army.
Right.
And because of that, they weren't able to carry their battle flags anymore.
No, I take it back. They walked to Tupelo.
Oh, right. Oh,
they
yeah.
Visited, yep. Right. They went to Tupelo, which I think is where Elvis is from, by the way, not for nothing.
Yep. Saw the shrine that SD looked up for himself.
Yeah. No, it was Tupelo. They marched to Tupelo, picked up the train in Tupelo, Mississippi, went east, and I cannot remember. I can't remember where they got off, but they walked the rest of the way. But that's how they got there. It was Tupelo.
Alec just asked which biography I'm reading about Beauregard. It's called Napoleon in Gray, and I think it's by Harry T. Williams. It's an older biography. It's from like the 1950s. So it's got there's some stuff that he just doesn't mention that I wish he talked about regarding Beauregard. But it's a good overview of his life. Williams is very dry sense of humor. He's hilarious. He hates Braxton Bragg. He hates Davis. He likes Hardee.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But Alex reading, his Dreams of Victory by, it's from the Emerging Civil War series. I've heard that one is really good. Emerging Civil War books are great. And the ones about the battles often include driving tours with them. Like there's, we took them with us out to Atlanta, and that's how we were able to find things like Ringgold Gap and find out where the monument for David Ireland in the 137th New York is at Ringgold Gap. They are great books. Like the Emerging Civil War are great to have with you if you're on a battlefield, because they often include the driving tours as well.
Okay. Yeah, no question.
But the Beauregard biography I'm reading, Napoleon in Gray, and it's worth checking out, even though it's older. It holds up pretty well, but there's still some stuff where I'm like, why aren't you talking about this aspect of his life?
There's a lot of aspects. There's a lot of aspects of these things that you don't study. And that's what's neat about it. It's just a lot of fun. It definitely is.
But it's still, it's an interesting read. I'm into the part now where it's post-Civil War, and it talks about how he was really debating staying in the United States because he was really not dealing well with the South losing. Beauregard was not a Longstreet when it came to the Civil War at all. And I know he gets involved in the Louisiana lottery at some point, but he contemplated going and fighting over in Europe. He had offers for that as well. I think the Egyptian, whoever led Egypt at the time, the Pasha, I think his name was, he was like, yeah, you can come and command an army. And for some reason that didn't happen. But then finally, I don't know, I think it was close to the 1880s or late 1870s that Beauregard decides to stay in the US. And David said that's a good biography of him. Like, not sure which one he's referring to, but yeah, I Want to Get Dreams of Victory by Sean Michael Chick of the Emerging Civil War. That's
Beauregard's another guy who kind of died miserable, unfortunately. The story what's interesting about him was they buried him barefoot for some reason. And they just did this to him. They just took his shoes off and buried him. And I'm sure there's a story behind that. Maybe they just needed the shoes. But it's one of those stories I always think about. He's one of the more popular ghost stories down there too, by the way.
Yeah, he apparently haunts in Louisiana.
He says, "Boo, regard."
So Alex said that the author Sean Michael Chick says that it's the best book. The one I'm reading is the best biography on him. So that's pretty cool. And Beauregard, Alex says Beauregard, like Rosecrans, I feel are both underrated. I would agree with that. Beauregard's he's very underrated. Like he's a guy that was just not utilized.
No, I mean, don't forget he takes over for Shiloh when Johnston goes down unexpectedly, and he embellishes their situation going in early, saying they basically have this thing won. Then he has to eat crow after they get beat. But he puts his ass in the front line. He's riding on the horse right up front with his sword at the hornet's nest, and he's think I'm gonna win this battle or die trying. But it's when he fell back to Corinth, Mississippi, is when he fell back out of that. That's what put him in the doghouse. Was he retreated with those Quaker logs and fell back, and that didn't sit too well the home front back at Richmond. And that's too bad because he's like a cop who does something wrong, gets chained to a desk, and spends the rest of his career as a desk cop.
But I understand why he had to leave Corinth, though, because the water was poisoned, and he figured that out. And he's like, Jesus, the troops are getting sick. We need to get them out of here. But he puts up the parrot guns. Or not the parrot guns.
No, he does. But don't forget, too, you've got Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio coming in.
Yeah.
Lew Wallace has finally arrived. And so you have a strong army against your guys. Don't forget, too, Shiloh was a mess for the Confederacy. You had them all intertangled. They're fighting.
That's what Claiborne said. Claiborne was like, it was a mess.
It was a mess. And Johnson's dead, and they realized they had to fall back. And if it wasn't for the weather, I mean, that rain that hit in early April, they could have run right through Grant and dumped him in Pittsburgh Landing before Buell got there. So a lot of this is lucky, and a lot of it's luck, but they could have used him, especially when you're looking at that endless line of biohazard people they rolled through that army in that southern that western theater, because you could have had an adult in the room, because Bragg was over his skis in a lot of it. He really was. And then you end up with Johnston, who was pretty strong about it, but he wasn't aggressive. He did a great job slowing Sheridan. I mean, Sherman to Atlanta. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about some of the things he did following through, we talked a lot about, you mentioned Pickett's Mill. Yeah. He did a good job delaying. You weren't going to delay that Sherman army, but you beat them, but you're going to delay them.
Not only can you delay them, but you can cost the men. And that's the one thing that, Thomas ended up having this kind of come to Jesus chat with Sherman after one of the battles. And Sherman's like, oh, well, we didn't, I guess today went okay, we lost, but whatever. And Thomas is like, if we have any more battles like that, we're not going to have an army by the time we get to Atlanta. We're losing way too many men. David mentions Rosecrans is incredibly underrated. We did that episode about him, and we talked about that he is underrated.
Rosecrans, his gas tank ran out mentally, and that was his issue. There's no question.
I mean, my opinion on Rosecrans is that by the time Chickamauga rolled around, he had PTSD from what happened to him witnessing his best friend Garrosh get killed at Stones River.
Not just that, but I mean,
just everything else.
I think he realized that I don't want to say they were fortunate to win Stones River, but he kind of was. You mentioned Sheridan. He had that really good moment there.
Yeah.
It was not a good situation overall for guys like Bragg. There was an opportunity missed, no question. When you're driving your enemy right back to their escape route instead of separating them from it, that doesn't usually end too well. But Rosecrans sits on his ass for months. After when he's sitting down there after Stones River in Murfreesboro, until he finally pulls off the Tullahoma campaign, which really is
brilliant.
Tullahoma campaign is his greatest moment. But again, he did not have a lot of resistance.
No,
right.
But there's some brilliant moments in the Tullahoma campaign. I mean, Lincoln said that it was one of the most brilliant campaigns of the Civil War. And just that time when he sends out, that's when John T. Wilder, his Lightning Brigade, really comes into their own. And Rosecrans is having to fight with the administration too. He's not just sitting there idly.
No,
he's
I know.
Saying I need supplies. And he's like, I want to have mounted infantry. I think that would work. And Halleck is like, mounted infantry are useless. And that's when John T. Wilder's like, well, let me do my thing. And he does that raid and comes back with no casualties.
But Rosecrans' Tullahoma campaign doesn't do that if he's fighting Lee or Jackson.
No.
It doesn't end that way for them because that would have been a lot different. But he right guy, right time. Mm-hmm. But Beauregard, I mean, he does come back later on. But yeah, I mean, he had the opportunity at Shiloh. He let it go. There's no question he did. He took his foot off the gas and he had him 28-3 and he let him off and they got beat.
That's what Ryan said. If they had a better first day plan, they might have been able to end Grant and Sherman right there.
Well, that's the thing too, is that they literally caught them by their pants down.
Oh, they did.
And they did drive them. And especially when you have Wallace not there yet and Buell's not there yet, there was an opportunity there and they missed. They absolutely missed it. And he did pump the brakes too early. He wrote his victory letter. We got this. He spiked the ball, And then what happens later is Buell shows up, they rally, they push them back. And that's unfortunate. And yes, the attack plan on that first day in April of 62, it was a complete mess. You had dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, right? You had regiments all mixed up, soldiers fighting with different companies.
Well, Claiborne said at one point he was under the command of Bragg, and he was kind of like, WTF, like, what am I doing? Like, why am I here? But I mean, you do have moments that come out of Shiloh that are starting to create these generals that on both sides that they will rise to become to become better generals.
Like, no, but the overall point, I like Rosecrans. I think it's extremely underrated. Yeah. I mean, he was a situation where because of the Battle of Iuka, he really dicked himself politically with Grant. And at that point, Grant's going to spend every moment looking to undermine him. But it doesn't take away from Tullahoma. But I said before, going against a stronger guy than Bragg, I don't think Lee, I don't think Jackson, I don't think any of those guys sit back like he did, like Bragg did, and let him get pants the way he did. Well, who knows? Maybe he would have, but I think
he might have. We'll never know. The other thing too about the whole the whole Shiloh thing is you have like Grant creates the scapegoat in Lew Wallace, which is really unfair because it should have been Sherman. Sherman was the one that really fucked it up. And I've had people come at me about that are adamant that Sherman did not screw it up. But it's like, if you read the letters that Sherman is writing to his brother John, he does kind of hint like, we kind of got caught off guard. Like,
no, they did. And even Iuka, you think about it, I mean, that's an unfortunate situation because people blame Grant for sitting on his ass, but really he sent those two colonels to find out what the hell was going on, and they got lost and never came back.
Yeah.
So it's not for lack of effort, but again, if you're Rosecrans and you end up in this major brawl and you get no support from Grant and you're getting no word from him for 2 days, you're going to complain about it. But I mean, did he have to go to that Cincinnati newspaper and complain? That's what got him.
He didn't, but did Grant have to, like, also on the other side of it is like, there's these guys, I mean, Rosecrans shouldn't have done that, but Grant, I love Grant. He's amazing general, probably the best out of the Civil War, but he could hold a grudge unless your name was Sherman or Sheridan. He was going to hold a grudge, and he was going to hold it for a really long time. And he held it against Rosecrans for the rest of their lives. I
think a lot of that comes from the fact that Grant just didn't trust anybody. He trusts. I mean, don't forget he got screwed over by guys like Halleck. You've got guys like Charles Dana, Rawlins being sent to babysit you in the Vicksburg campaign. You've got snakes all around you. So you're going to trust only a certain amount of people. So when you're Rosecrans and you'll go against him, of course you're going to fall out of favor. Of course he's not going to support Hooker. Right. No. And look up, of course. So it's one of those, if you got a Grant's doghouse, you were in his doghouse. Don't forget too, he didn't trust George Thomas.
No, he didn't, which is really unfair. Alec actually raised an interesting point here, and I didn't think about this, but he said early in the war, Rosecrans defeated Lee, so it would be a big what if the two went toe to toe later in the war. If Rosecrans knows he's going against Lee, how does he change Tullahoma campaign? That's something too.
That's the thing. Well, Lee would have had the terrain. He would have defended those gaps better, I imagine. Who knows? Maybe he wouldn't have. But
that's a really good point, though. Rosecrans had already knew Lee.
He did, but don't forget. I mean, Nathan Kimball beat Lee too.
Yeah,
and he beat you. So that doesn't mean. But I'm not trying to. I love Rosecrans. I'm not trying to diminish Rosecrans at all. But I think I think a lot of these things is right place, right time.
Yeah.
I mean, Lee pre-Gettysburg was pretty good, right? He really, really was. Lee post-Gettysburg was not so much.
Well, that's because his health too was not
right. No, he was. But again, that would have been an interesting battle. It would have been a better battle than friggin' Bragg versus Rosecrans. Bragg didn't even fight; he just fell back.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah, frankly,
that's a good point, though.
That is, I didn't think of it that way. It's like, so would Rosecrans have changed his campaign if he's going against Lee? That's and that's what the what if thing about history is really good, and why the people that come on to these silly little things we do on Saturday and Sunday mornings is really interesting because they ask great questions, or they they say, well, how about this, this could have happened this way. Frank mentions, I find it astounding how someone can come up to anyone else to hate on a Civil War figure. I mean, they've been dead for 100+ years. Everyone should just study who they want. That's what we've been saying all along.
Well, we said this for a while.
Just study.
Well, we said for people tend to gravitate towards the people they like, and then they hold them like people hold a sports team, right? So, and then anybody who's a rival, it's if you find a way to disparage them, which I never really understood. I don't have a favorite general. I don't hate any of these people. I mean, as far as their personas, I study them individually because they're all good and they're all bad in different ways.
Yeah.
But I don't hold on. Like, I like guys like Charles Tilden, for example. I like Howard, guys like that. But I realize that there are mistakes made, and I'm not. Yeah. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Howard is flawless, because he was more flawless than not. But people take that and they forget everything he did positive, and they just label him at Chancellorsville, which really, I don't want to say it was his fault, but it really wasn't at the same time, because
there's a lot going on there.
People don't realize Hooker taking away Barlow's division and setting him with Sickles was a big deal at that flank at Chancellorsville, because that took away a lot of guys. He wasn't going to win anyway. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, and then people take that to paint with a broad brush and blame him for Gettysburg when he wasn't even in charge of the 11th Corps at the Battle of Gettysburg on the 1st of July after Reynolds. So you want to blame somebody, blame Schurz for that. So, but again, all these people, I like Grant, but I realize that he had his errors. I look at even the Confederates. I think Claiborne's the best they had.
Yeah. Same.
But again, he had his issues. I mean, he got his ass handed in with Hinman over there heading into the into Chattanooga. During that campaign, they all had their moments. But again, people, their rivalries. People hold on to this stuff.
Oh, they do, and they get really, like Alex said, that I love Rosecrans, but I like Grant as well. But there's a strong hate against Grant from the Rosecrans fans. That is so true.
But that's just he just says though. It's fans. Yeah. And it's like you can like whoever you like, but again, you sometimes you'll go online. Back when you had Twitter, and you would say something positive about Rosecrans, and then you get the Grant people up your ass. They were
like, "What about Grant?" Blah blah blah. I'm like,
they get so defensive. If I mentioned when I was on Twitter, I'd mentioned David Ireland. I got my ass handed to me from the Chamberlain people. And so it's like you saying something positive about Rosecrans somehow diminishes Grant in their minds, and vice versa. And it doesn't. But that's how people see it. People hold on to points like grim death, and they hold on to pure stubbornness, and they don't let it go. And by doing that, they're really robbing themselves, because if you want to like a guy, if you want to really study a guy, you look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you can be able to talk about the foibles and talk about the things that they didn't do well, to give you a more 360 view. The worst people are the friggin' Lincoln people. And I'll tell you that.
I would agree with that.
Who sit there and tell you with a straight face, he never swore in his life.
He did. I'm sorry. But if you're dealing with somebody like McClellan, you are going to drop an F-bomb every once in a while. And there's also some that say he didn't drink. There's evidence that he did.
Okay. And that he did not love Anne Rutledge. He only loved Mary Lincoln. I mean, come on, man. I mean, people, just because he was shot on Good Friday didn't mean he rose on Easter Sunday either. I mean, but that doesn't mean that I don't like Lincoln, because I think he's the best president we ever had. But you have to look at the overall picture and stay objective to it. Because how can you study history if you're only looking at one side? You hold on to it, right?
You can't. And also, if you're studying that one side, if you ignore certain things, and we talked about this with the riots, like ignoring something like the riots and ignoring the fact that racism was just as rampant in the North as it was in the South. I mean, William Tecumseh Sherman was a vehement racist his entire life. And he laid into Howard about Howard and the work he did for the Freedmen's Bureau, saying, you shouldn't do this. And it's because he's a racist, and Howard was an abolitionist. And that's where the two really clash. But you know what? I will give Howard this. He stood by how he felt his whole life. And he never backed away from it, despite the ridicule, despite the criticism that he got. He never backed away from it. He always stood by what he believed. And that's really something, especially the time he was in, because the one thing that, I discovered doing the research about Howard is that he was ahead of his times in a number of ways.
Right.
But he took a lot of shit for that too. But he never backed away from how he felt about something, especially his feelings towards the African Americans, that he was like, I'm just going to keep doing this.
Well, to thy own self be true is a phrase that I coined.
Yeah.
But that's the case. Anyway, why don't we get ready to jump off? It's almost noon already. Time flies when you're nerding out, Mary. So why don't we get ready to jump off here? So, so it's Sunday. So what do we got coming up? We have the Crater we're going to do this week. Yeah. That'll be a fun episode to do. And we have to schedule that Maine at Gettysburg.
I know we do. Yeah, I know.
Mary's asleep at the switch here.
I'm not. There's 2 people doing this podcast.
If I reached out to an author, you'd kill me. Let's be honest.
No, I wouldn't.
Oh, please, child, please. Anyway, so we're going to get that scheduled. So off we go. And then we're going to do another roundtable soon, too. So, all right.
Yeah,
so
we just been really, June and July have been crazy months for us.
No, this is just summertime is a tough aspect of my life.
Jim mentions Lincoln was a man, and like all men, we all have faults, but the Ethan Allen story is proof enough that he swore.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. I mean, like I said, there's only one guy who's perfect, and that, of course, is Tom Brady. But everybody else has their flaws, and that's the reality. So, that being said, why don't we jump off? So, Mary, let's plan on jumping off here. So, everybody have a great weekend. It's a beautiful day here. It's cloudy, but it's like 65 degrees.
Yeah, it's really nice here.
It's nice. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. So,
so thanks for everybody that hopped on with us here for this silly thing we do. Thank you for the questions, the comments, the discussion. We could not do these lives without you. So thank you so much. No, it's good. It's good discussion today. It's always fun nerding out with you. So guys, have a great rest of the weekend. We will talk to you all soon. Have a great rest of the weekend. I know it's Sunday, which kind of sucks. Tomorrow's Monday, but summertime is winding down. It's almost August. Can you believe it's almost August, by the way? Yeah. Hey, my birthday's in a few weeks.
I know that. The big 6-0.